Just going to direct all my questions to the panelists. So first, perhaps, Nicholas, to you. You're doing a lot of work around new uses for software and network design techniques as applied to urban resilience and adaptation. And as Will was mentioning, and as we've all read, society is coming under a lot of pressure from climate change, from uncertain environment, from massive shifts in population. So could you just kind of talk about the work that you're doing, and then we connect it to what Anne is doing, which is somewhat related.
Absolutely. So, my two qualifications, I guess, for being here at the Interplanetary Festival are having studied the history of the Apollo spacesuit, which was handmade by seamstresses from the Platex Bra and Girdle Company, and then also doing a lot of work around the role of networks and designing network interventions in cities, and the two are actually related in some ways. Part of my interest in the Apollo spacesuit, which actually started a project that started as a lecture here at the Santa Fe Institute in 2002, is precisely the fact that, unlike everything else in the Apollo program, and I'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, the A7L spacesuit was actually made by hand, not using engineering techniques, but using traditional techniques of hand sewing 21 layers of fabric to a 64th of an inch tolerance with no pins. And that, I came to understand that suit as a kind of medium or mediating organizational device between the logic of the body, which has its own very profound and essential logic, and the logic of this larger engineering system which the Apollo program represented. And I thought that this would be a kind of metaphor or parable for how we design for complex systems and environments here on Earth, particularly cities. But what I discovered was, in fact, that there was a huge intellectual transfer between NASA and urban design and urban administration in the 1960s and 1970s, mostly focused on applying very strict and traditional systems design and technological techniques to what at the time was seen as the great problem of the age, being the problem of the city, the problem of downtowns, and that most of those techniques weren't, to put it mildly, very successful. And so this started my own work as a designer, trying to think, what is the logic of cities? What kind of a problem is a city? And how can we use the tools and technologies we have available today, which are incredible in their sophistication, to design along with and along the contours of the actual organizational, metabolic, complex logic that cities actually have. And one of the, a lot of my work nowadays goes under the rubric of what the Rockefeller Foundation in its work on cities has dubbed resilience. And this word resilience has come to mean what we're, be the kind of framing device for how we think about designing for climate change and for extreme conditions here on Earth. It's a word I despise. And I'll tell you why, and in two ways. It comes from the Latin for a spring's return to form. And what that implies is, first of all, things will go back to the way that they ever were, which is not the case, and B, that the route to get there will be linear, which will also never be the case. And so the words I like a lot more are words like robustness and evolvability that talk and think about adaptation. And the extremities, one of my interests originally in the spacesuit came from the fact that from a quote by the architectural historian Rainer Banham, who said we learn the most about architecture in its extremes, and often extremes means even in its absence. And I guess I would end with the story of so my work at Berkeley, both at the Center for New Media and in the College of Environmental Design at Berkeley, is very much around applying the latest technologies, working with large data sets to design networks of micro-interventions, other kinds of design methods that can help us design along the logic of cities versus against them. But as part of this research effort, I took a studio a couple of years ago up to the north coast of the Seward Peninsula in Alaska in early February. So it was 40 degrees, and I learned then that it's 40 degrees is the same in Celsius and Fahrenheit. It's just below, 40 degrees below zero, no matter how you cut it. We met with, as a group of professors and students, with a group of Inupiaq villagers that the federal government has termed America's first climate change refugees, because the barrier islands which we forced them to settle are now being eroded as the sea ice changes its schedule because of temperature changes in the Arctic. That climate change refugees label is one that the native people resist, because they have always been nomads and they were forced to settle in one place by us. But they do talk a lot about adaptability and designing for change. And in fact, there was a long, in my research before we went, I came across this long traditional Inupiaq word for designing with the tools you have to suit the place you are and the time that you're in. And I thought this was, an amazing concept, potentially transferable to this larger problem of designing with resilience. And so we went up there. We flew in a 7-person plane and met with village elders and local guides. And we asked, and my question was, well, how do you use this word these days, and how does this concept, come to shape your thoughts about designing for the extremes of this environment and the extremes of its transformation? And then, of course, I learned, thanks to the FCC and American civil society, these villages, even though they're incredibly isolated, have cable television and cell phone service and all those good things. And so there's a lot of popular culture there. And I was told, well, in fact, that Inupiaq word doesn't get used anymore. What we really just say is that we use the word MacGyver. I think there's a lot of great truth to that. We have a kind of culture, especially within architectural culture and design culture, that we're somehow going to be designing something new to the great gizmo, as Banham also called it, that's somehow going to solve things. Whereas in fact, everything that evolutionary biology and the study of complex systems and robustness in complex systems has shown us is that it's in fact systems that have gone through many, many layers of transformation, adaptation, that are the most resilient and the most robust to change as well. So we're probably already looking at the solutions that we need, but we need to continuously amplify and reinvent them.
Thank you, Nicholas. And picking up on that, you're doing a lot of work around the interchange between culture, technology, environment, ecosystems, and Nicholas set that up, I think, for you to follow up. Do you want to just expand on that?
And more than that, I think I've known Nicholas.
There's no mic. No.
So I said if one didn't work, it should be mine.
Do we have a handheld or something we can?
Freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's on.
Yeah.
That's on.
Freedom.
Yeah.
No, I was just saying that what's really interesting.
No.
Yes? No. Yes? No? Still no? Yes? Yes?
No.
No?
You want to? This works. Can I get?
You want to, should we hand it over to Jake?
Yeah. Why don't you just hold this?
One fundamental truth of technology is that it never quite works the way it's
Nope.
supposed to.
Does this one now work? Yeah. This one, thank you. Whew.
It works.
Okay,
All right.
good. I prefer holding anyways.
Yes.
It's a sense of freedom. Yeah, I was just saying that it's just such a pleasure to be on the stage with these people. I've followed Nick's work for a while, and there's lots of divergences and convergences and kind of paradoxes. My coming to this topic is a little messy, in that I am a practicing architect, but I started in astrophysics, so over the years I began to realize there were certain analogies between human systems, which is what we really We build for context. Architects do. We're most associated with things like buildings, but in general we're trying to build contexts that have possibilities for the way people live their messy lives. And it can be possibilities that exist, or it can be about new possibilities. I've kind of moved into that new possibilities area. And what started for me back in 2004 when I was asked by one of my graduate students at MIT to work on the first colony on Mars. It was not cool back then. It was totally sci-fi. None of the other architecture professors would touch it. And I said, fine, as long as we have a Mars expert, this was MIT, we have someone dealing with space flight, the logistics of space flight, and I'm only going to take it on if we look at the technical, but we're looking at the very human issues that go along with colonizing, not just getting to Mars, which we heard about this morning, but actually colonizing it and living in an environment where the mediation with the space is very, very close and all that. So we took that on. Needless to say, what's really interesting as I look back at that project now, and his index, his table of contents, reads as a world building map would read today. I do a lot of work in world building. So fast forward to 2014, and I've been asked by the White House, the Office of Science, Technology, Policy, to join a group they're putting together in a very surreptitious manner, which is about colonizing the solar system, bootstrapping the colonization of the solar system. And it's a lot of scientists, similar to the ones we heard this morning. It's even industry people. There's a company that's already looking at mining asteroids. A lot of biologists and science fiction writers, world builders, etc. And it was a fascinating discussion because it was the world building that began to be a really great tool. It's a very rigorous process that actually brings together these really disparate people. I had gained a reputation for this working with Alex McDowell, who did the prototyping of the future in Minority Report. So not dystopian, not utopian, true world building of how different things, from communication to infrastructure to sex to drug use, etc., put them together, think about the future of each of them and what are the implications of that. At the time, in a seemingly incongruous manner, my architecture, I was more and more being brought into difficult cultural contexts and was finding myself working in what people call precarious communities. Cities within cities that have emerged around a very different extreme phenomenon, which is extreme poverty. And other cities within cities, so think about the favelas, think about Shanghai, Kibera, and other cities within cities that had emerged because of extreme change around climate events. So the idea of, and when I say cities, I don't mean just camps or settlements, I mean robust structures. So I just want to back up 1 second and just talk about what is. You really need to remember that a city is not just buildings. The city is a Venn diagram between, think material infrastructure and form. So pipes and streets and subways and policies and buildings. That's one of the Venn diagram pieces. The second one are all of the environmental resources we have and the constraints and the systems like weather that are part of building a city and what gives it its texture and its specific ethos. Thirdly, cities are complex political and economic and social systems, policies, etc. Fourth in this Venn diagram are the way we live as human beings, the stories we tell, the purposes and motivation, the emotions, all of the things that give us identity. And the fifth are the fact that cities are an evolution of both top-down practices and bottom-up emergent phenomenon. A push and pull between the planners, the designers, the technologists, the politicians, the economists that would like to transfer this rationalized logic around a certain ideology, of course, into form. And then this other emergent activity around people living messy lives, pushing back against the engineers, often finding workarounds, hacking it, anything that begins to create a vibrant city. Once you understand a city that way, you begin to ask, oh, okay, fine. If we're going to if we're going to actually look into this extreme environment of space, is it just technology? Is it good enough to say, we'll figure out the technology, we will get up there, we will survive, and that's good enough? Every tabula rasa is never a tabula rasa. You bring with it all of those social systems and the baggage. And the minute one steps on the ground, no matter how embryonic that settlement, those things are with you. So I'm working with a group up in the Yukon, which we're looking at above the 60th parallel, and we're looking at the future of the Yukon through a world-building process, meaning expert technologists, people who care about mining, people, all the First Nations, all aspects of it, as a proxy for the possibility of a new colony on another planet. And by proxy, I mean using it as an opportunity, not just to say, how would you build in this extreme climate? The interesting thing about the Yukon, there is above the 60th parallel, it is the one area that's undergoing the most radical environmental change and the most radical geopolitical change. China sent 40 ships through that upper passage last year in 2 months. Oil tankers and other ships. Russia is constructing new outposts on their eastern border. The Yukon is no longer a cul-de-sac, there is a backdoor in. The negotiation of the geopolitics of that region is very, very interesting. So we're using this as a proxy to begin to world build a future where can we talk about a desirable future and not just a default one, in which the technology is there. And Nicholas talked about new technologies. We have lots of new tools. We have new ways of understanding why people do what they do. We have new ways of asking people why they do what they do. We have world building. I'm working at the RAND Corporation. We have new ways of modeling where messy people systems are in there. So we're really, really at a point in time where looking at the future is not like me back in MIT in 2004, which is purely speculative, smart speculation, where we actually can be both more radical and also more inclusive of all the things that make our cities. So that was how we.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Anne, you spoke about new contexts and new possibilities, and Jake, you're working on autonomous vehicles, you're working on pervasive mobility, around zero emission vehicles, all pushing towards a new environment, new possibilities. Tell us a little bit about the work that you do and how it may fit in with what Nicholas and Anne spoke about.
Yeah. Before we go any further, can we all hear each other? Good. So I'll talk a little bit about autonomous vehicles in a second, the work that I'm doing with a company called Zoox, based in San Francisco. But just kind of give a little bit of a background on how I got here. So I actually come from a music composition and contemporary art background. After graduating school, studying composition, I very quickly started doing exhibitions in museums and galleries. And so that's kind of where I learned the tools of my trade. Was for a time with a group called Soundwalk Collective, based in New York City, and then independently as a solo artist, and did operas in the Tate Modern and kind of massive, really loud speaker installations in places like Venice, Italy, and came across a challenge, which is that engaging with the art gallery in museums, you start to understand that sound can influence human behavior in really profound ways. And I was starting to build up a lot of tools to influence people to engage with my work. But as a platform, it's actually quite nice. And the impact and the ways in which you can influence people are very interesting and meaningful, I think, and incredibly valuable. But there's a much broader kind of world out there with really important challenges. And it's kind of lucky, but sound is one of the most underutilized tools in design. So there's a lot of opportunity there. there's an enormous amount of value that's literally waiting to be pulled out of the air just by thinking about how you can solve some of these intractable design challenges with sound. I'll give an example. One of the first projects that I worked with trying to apply this methodology in a kind of more practical way was a collaboration that I did with the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. They run a series of mobile medical trucks in rural Malawi, delivering HIV medication. And we were talking about some of the challenges that they're facing, and from the foundation, they were saying, there's a lot of stigma from men being seen standing in line receiving treatment for HIV. Now, of course, social stigma is kind of an emotional challenge, and sound is a really great tool for dealing with an emotional kind of problem. So a little bit haphazardly, but we said, okay, let's try a pilot program and see if we can influence it somehow. So kind of using actually like the ice cream truck methodology, we got a bunch of military grade speakers donated from a company named LRAD and hooked them up to these trucks, and were able to kind of amplify the voice and the sonic impact that these vehicles had, and it made it a lot easier for people to find testing sites, and had some positive kind of results in terms of the pilot program that we ran for just kind of improving the efficacy of being able to deliver HIV medication. So this was like a very small scale pilot program that was run, but it was kind of something that opened my eyes to, okay, there's some possibility here. So moving from there, I ended up starting an architecture firm called Public Decibel that focuses on auditory architecture. And that led me to what I'm doing now, which is designing the sounds that autonomous vehicles make. Now you might be thinking, okay, cool, they make engine sounds or things like that. It's an interesting challenge because the sound of cities is one of the noise pollution is one of the kind of most intractable challenges that we face, and as Anne has been talking about, and Nick has talked about, cities are very complex environments with a lot of emergent properties, and I think sound is one of the least addressed ways that we can actually reduce complexity, increase the efficiency with which people interact with their urban environments, and also kind of a broader level, we kind of have a moral imperative to engage with this. There's the socioeconomic impact of how people hear their environment. You kind of in film and television, they often use the trope of the person sitting in their bedroom and the train rushes by a few inches from their window, and we kind of use this as a way to kind of auditory noise pollution as a way to mark somebody being of a lower socioeconomic status. So the interesting thing with electric autonomous mobility is that it kind of provides a white sheet opportunity to rethink this. When internal combustion engines are going away, and suddenly you have vehicles that can produce sound only when absolutely needed, based on the context that they perceive in their environment, we can actually make car and automotive sounds disappear entirely, except for very specific moments when it's absolutely necessary for safety case, or for an efficiency challenge that is trying to solve. So that's really exciting. So I kind of took the leap into industry and have been involved with Zoox. Zoox as a company is unique because we're rethinking what a vehicle should be. So it's kind of this idea that strapping a bunch of sensors onto a pre-existing car that has pedals and the steering wheel is kind of similar to installing an engine onto a horse-drawn buggy. And really, when you have full autonomy, you really need to rethink the object and what this kind of space can represent and how it should exist in the city. So there's a lot of interesting tools that we've been developing to make that happen. And yeah, as you've been talking about, I think it's always nice when you have this kind of marriage of available technology, and also it's always great to have funding so that you can actually pursue these things. And we're in a really nice kind of moment where things are starting to work. So the vehicles are driving around San Francisco, and our testing fleet is doing really well. So these are not kind of like blue sky ideas that we're talking about. These are things that are being developed and being tested today. So it's an interesting challenge. But so for me, that's kind of how I've been engaging with this. Is ultimately the goal is cities are of course incredibly complex spaces, but how can we kind of harness the information that exists in cities, kind of improve dynamics, improve pedestrian safety, improve the efficiency of how traffic moves through a city. And turns out that one of the kind of best situated tools to do that is actually with sound. So yeah, that's a little bit about what I'm working on.
Thank you. It's interesting how it all comes together. So it's really how everything that Nicholas, Anne, and JQ mentioned comes together in the real world. So I do work around urbanization, and one of the problems that these cities asked us was, how do you help or create new services that would help the elderly and the disabled, actually. And if you begin to unpack that problem, you find that there are many stakeholders, there are many different systems, that they all need to be connected. Sound, we hadn't thought about it, but would probably be a challenge that we would have to overcome, because they may not be able to hear that things that we take for granted, and therefore what's the impact on safety. So taking some that into account, and perhaps for you, as we begin to think about these bigger problems that these urban areas and cities face, say with climate change or the aging population, how do you give that work purpose? How do you align the different stakeholders, and perhaps some of your experiences as you were working with the Yukon, and then after that maybe you, Nicholas, as you also work, how did you bring those groups together, the techniques you used, and some lessons learned perhaps that we could take away?
There's a beautiful chapter in Nick's book where he talks about how NASA, in addition to the spacesuit and the whole space mission, felt that the technology would be very useful for cities, that all of the kind of systems engineering that was developing at that time could be applied not just to this high risk, high money thing, but that what they considered the danger of the cities, which is, if it was in the era of the 60s with the riots, just a lot of volatile and uncertain moments in the cities. And NASA, and I know I'm going to get it wrong, so help me out. NASA was working with housing and urban development, and they basically said, can we take these systems approaches which try to deal with things that may go wrong and uncertainty, but specifically control and command of information, which is really interesting. Think of the control room, right? Can we take these and can we look at building new housing where we embed control and command in it? I am getting to your question, but needless to say, nothing worked. And there's one quote I think you've got in the book where you said the people didn't like what we were doing for them, or they didn't understand what we were doing. I think they even used the preposition, they didn't understand what we were doing to them, right? And how it was for their benefit, and they'd have better lives. Blah, blah, blah. So there's two parts to that. One is not to say that the technology and the engineering and the planning isn't valuable. I know it's double negatives. It is valuable. And it's not just that they didn't ask people, could we do this? It is this idea that cities are complex organisms. They're the only man-made organism that exists. So when I work with groups, it's never one-off, it's not brainstorming, it's none of that. It's trying to take people of different interest or equity in the problem, from the bankers to the individuals themselves, understanding that it's not appropriate to develop a kind of colonialist mentality, we will help them. It's understanding that we're all players in the same game. Let's come to the room, let's widen our apertures, all of us, and begin to say, in 10, 15 years, if this were much, much better, what would it look like for you? What would it look like for you, the engineer, the economist up in the Yukon, the miner, the extreme sports person, the First Nations? What would it look like for you? And interestingly, with the First Nations, we're working in completely different language. They're so sophisticated. We have to talk about stories of the future that are like the stories of your past. When you have two millennia in your history, and you've had a really bad blip now, it's a different construct than when you're living in a city that's only about 200 years old. So the goal is to create a civic imagination across these different domains, coming to the room with the value and the dignity they have, and saying, what would it look like for you? Finding that in complexity science, we look for patterns, we look for anomalies, we look for conflicts, paradoxes. That's what we do. We look for those things and then mirror it back to try to get at that kind of better desirable state. Never with promises of perfection, never with promises of solving things that are unsolvable, but better states, much, much better states.
Thank you, Anne. I think you summarized it very well. I would say to expand on that point. One point I would make. I know it's the lingua franca and everyone has been using this word, but I would actually push back quite a bit in this context against the use of the word colonization. When we talk about cities across the earth, somehow space is still the context of space exploration it's still seen appropriate to borrow that idea of colonization. But that idea of colonization, one of the reasons we don't use the word any other places these days is it's based both on a conceptual and a legal idea of what was called terra nullius, which is interesting because it's this idea that there's nothing there, therefore we can go colonize it. And it was a legal fiction that was first mooted in the colonization of the United States. It became the legal basis for colonization in Australia. It became the legal basis for Antarctica, and then the concept was actually exported in the 1950s to become the legal basis of space exploration. This idea that when there's nothing there, you have certain rights, you can create certain perfect things, you can start from scratch, and all of our own American culture imagines that we built a city on the hill here, as the captain of the Mayflower said. And of course, the truth of the United States is that it wasn't empty. There was every part of this continent was occupied. The truth of outer space is also that it's not empty. There's no people there, but there's radiation, charged particles, all kinds of things that would and will make any kind of real occupation very hazardous. One of the issues that we have, particularly with climate change here on Earth, we're at this inflection point in history. There are more human beings alive today than have ever been alive in history. We're building more urban fabric in the next 40 years than we build in all of human civilization up until today. You know, and we're doing so at a time when anthropogenic climate change means that our circumstances and extreme circumstances of climate and cities here on Earth are so incredibly unpredictable and present those cities and that civilization with challenges that it will have never seen before. But just like the problems involved in colonization, those who most have to deal with the consequences are not those making the decisions. So those who live in the developing world, those who live near the equator, those who live in the global south will first have to deal with the effects of climate change on cities and are least equipped logistically and financially to deal with it. But this leads to another interesting point, that when I teach my introduction to design at Berkeley, we start with the scale of the house and the city, but then we end with something that Anne, I think, very rightly brought up, which is the idea of design at the scale of the planet. We will never terraform Mars. We will certainly never terraform Venus, but we will end up having to terraform Earth in the next century, in our own lifetimes. We will end up having to make design decisions at a global scale to attempt to maintain our world in the limits of our own ability to inhabit it. And what will, I believe, most force this issue is a taking back of power by those who are most affected by climate change. The government of India is putting up its own space station. It has enormous industrial capacities, but it has to deal with the consequences of carbon-induced climate change far more than the societies that actually drove that. And so who are we to tell the government of India that it should not put sulfur into the high atmosphere that will disperse, scientists think, over the course of several years, that will bring down global temperatures, that will reduce enormous events of heat-related deaths and strains on infrastructure. That will happen. We have supposedly laws against this kind of thing now, but within 15 or even 20 years, I think it will be a reality. And so we have to decide as a global city how we are going to balance the consequences and the economics of those of a kind of a carbon economy that has privileged the few at the expense of the many. Just like the idea of we've colonized the atmosphere, really, is what it comes down to, in a way that we also imagined that we could colonize the New World or even outer space. And I think I would encourage a kind of global perspective on all those questions of colonization together.
Something that makes me think of, just going back to something that Anne said, when you have stakeholders in the room and you're doing a world building exercise to try and understand, well, what can we do? It's not appropriate to show up to the government of India and say, this is how you're going to solve your challenge. For me, this is something that I deal with a lot, especially doing like user testing around experiences that people have no context to possibly evaluate. It's something that I refer to as the alien lunch problem. So the alien lunch problem is, imagine you're on a spaceship and you're going to a foreign planet, and one of the stewardesses come out and says, hey, we're going to pre-order lunch before you arrive on that planet, and hands out menus to people. And you look at the menu and you say, well, I don't really understand what any of this food is. Well, okay, this is like pizza, that's like pasta, this is like ice cream. And so you can kind of make a link between a past experience, say, okay, well, I'm somebody that likes pizza, so I'm going to order pizza for this planet. But what you can't know about is how pizza in this alien planet, how the context of being on that land, how the air smells, how all these things combine to drastically impact your preferences of pizza on that planet that are completely irrelevant to your previous experiences. And this is something that exists not only for the designers who are leading a community through a world building exercise. It's not only for the community themselves saying, like, what are you doing to me? It's also for the designers. We build things all the time that you see how people utilize it once it's out there in the world, and the utilization is completely separated from the original intent. A good, easy example that I think a lot of people can relate to is skateboarding. Park benches and curbs and all these things were never conceived of to be basically like a playground for people on a skateboard. But of course you can extrapolate that to almost every dimension of urban design and generally of just solving challenges through design. And so I think that the lesson that we can take from that is that solutions have to be modular rather than optimal. And an example is when you have to invest a significant amount of resources, kind of being able to incorporate your own lack of knowledge about the future into your design solution. Modular housing and prefab construction are things that people are starting to work on, and there's a few companies like Katera and a few others who are starting to build structures that are not intended to be permanent structures, but they have an appropriate lifespan. Not 100-year buildings, but maybe 20-year buildings. And I think that a lot of the challenges that we face over, especially thinking about terraforming on Earth, are that a lot of pressure to find optimal solutions. And there's no such thing as an optimal solution as we would have the knowledge now to build. So that's what that would look like in all these different, from energy consumption to the kind of information that you want to relay to pedestrians to improve, the efficiency of urban public space usage, things like that. It's an interesting challenge, and what exactly is a modular design solution look like? I don't really have the answer, but it's something that I think is going to be more robust to the future than saying, well, what is the best answer?
Well, and this idea of optimization, I think, is really interesting, because there really is a kind of belief that that's what we should do. Before we do anything, let's make sure we got it right. We never get it right. The internet is not right. Look what it's done to us. I love this. So this notion of terraforming, if you look around us, there are people already building stuff that show us potentially some of the way they're getting at it. I'm thinking of all these really large buildings, whether it's in India or in China. Really, really tall buildings where there are people that, my daughter was just in India, that don't leave the building. The building, it's 80 stories tall and everything's inside of it. The notion that there are already examples of mini cities being built as if they were space stations. There are examples of workarounds and kind of hacking economics, especially in Kenya, that look at other ways of how do we create other systems. So I think because we can't try it out before we go, how do we think about simulation as something both that's virtual, but much more complex, because we have much more complex modeling tools at the moment, much more really good ways of getting data in real time, not just data at static slices. But how do we set forth experiments that allow us to not optimize but start and see what happens and then go from there? I love this idea of, and some of those may be completely fictional. I worked with Alex McDowell. We worked on a little, basically a city out in the ocean called Rilao, which was a fragment of Rio moving out after an earthquake, and a fragment of LA. They got stuck in the ocean because of there was a plague and they couldn't come, and we had to terraform. We had to start terraforming. How do we begin to, all of us, engage in experiments, whether they're really robust experiments of the imagination that are grounded in really good data and modeling, and how do we look at things around us that are done differently, robust and resilient, these mega buildings in Shanghai where you never have to go out on the street. How do we look at those things? Also in China, they'll build whole cities based upon a certain ideology and a certain kind of aesthetic, the German village, the whatever, with the if it doesn't work, we'll tear it down and build it again. So how do we even look what's around us and see where there are examples to learn from?
You know, in the 1970s, the philosopher James Carse wrote a book, a wonderful book called Finite and Infinite Games. And the book is based on the thesis, all of you may know it, but I'll explain just in case that you know, there are two kinds of games in the world. There's finite games, and the culture of capitalism, the culture of often of engineering, is very much grounded in this idea of optimization. And optimization is tied closely to the idea of winning. You know, you optimize. You optimize an algorithm and you win. You optimize a trading strategy and you win. You optimize a betting strategy and you win, like Alex Holzhauer on Jeopardy. But there's this other kind of game, the infinite game, which is a game we often play when we're children, where the goal of the game is not to win. The goal of the game is to be able to keep playing. And so, but to play an infinite game effectively, if you remember from when you were a child, like at one point the stump represented a pit of lava, but then those version of the rules isn't working very well. So the pit of lava becomes a cloud that you have to climb up on. And so the purpose to the infinite game is that there's no strategy of optimization except for you always need to be changing the rules in order to actually be able to sustain it and keep playing. And I feel like we're at a moment in our larger civilization where certainly in this country, but the whole neoliberal project, if I can be so bold, is very much tied into the idea of treating the earth and treating resources and treating urbanization as if it's a finite game, and the idea is to win. The idea is to be able to build the perfect city, to be able to do the solve the perfect problem, and if we could do anything else in this generation, it would be to reorient the way in which we design towards infinite games, which is a process, therefore a constant process of reorientation and re-understanding and remaking and MacGyvering from one moment to the next.
But one of the key things is you have to be willing to play.
Yeah.
And so I don't know about you, but a lot of the people I work with, especially in corporation and in academia, they're not willing to play.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is not just that they're not willing to engage in the question and in the inquiry. They're not willing to let go of what they know and of how to do things. They're not willing to engage in playfulness, if that makes sense. And I don't mean that in a trivial way. I mean that in a speculative way where you don't always know what the answers are going to be. And I think that is very much part of it, and we really have to kind of engage in that.
I may have to interrupt, sorry, Jake, because I think we are kind of running out of time. And so probably one last bit, which is completely off chart, because that'll take 30 seconds each. We talked about solutions not being perfect, so you're about to go on this spaceship. You know that things haven't all been sorted out. You're going to Mars. It's going to be a long trip. You're probably not coming back. And you've got this little duffel bag, and you've got 5 things that you're allowed to carry. Jake, what are the 5 things that you would like to take? And then you, Nicholas, and then you, Al.
So I have a little bit of experience of like having to pack a bag with only 5 things to go somewhere secluded. I spent about a year in a Buddhist monastery in Tokyo, and remember packing my bag and getting some advice on what to bring, and so I'll share that advice with you because it was very useful. The first thing that I would put in there is a very warm sweater. The second thing is some sweatpants, and then in case it gets very hot, maybe like a jumpsuit that is cool, like supporting like the material that your shirt is made out of, kind of material, maybe with a hood, and some socks. And those are four things. If we can let the pair of socks be one thing. And then the fifth thing that I would put in there is not something to use, but just imagining that I'm going to an extreme place that requires a lot of creative thinking and problem solving, and I would bring a coffee filter. And the coffee filter for me is a symbol of, Anne has talked, there's a conversation here a lot about data, and if only we could have more data on this topic. And I think that actually the way to solve a lot of the complex challenges we're facing is not about trying to gather more data. We have all the data we need. I think it's actually about trying to apply an appropriate filter on that data, and that really the solutions are coming out of how we filter the data that we already have, rather than necessarily needing to have more data about a particular problem. So the coffee filter for me would be a reminder to kind of stay scrappy and work with what I have.
Thank you.
There's a great story when they convinced Story Musgrave to go up to fix the Hubble Space Telescope. He insisted on bringing a car jack, and they were like, "Why would you bring a car jack?" But he was Story Musgrave, so and they were convincing him to go back into space one more time. So he did, and he ended up, in fact, using the car jack to get the doors of the shuttle cargo bay closed after they had expanded too much, because they were. And so you'll never know what you need, but simple tools, duct tape. Mm-hmm. Definitely bring a roll of duct tape. In honor of Douglas Adams, I'd bring a towel. Because you never know when you'll need one. Maybe a car jack. Maybe I think that these are that simple tools that can expand and amplify human ingenuity are ways in which we modify things to suit the environment we have available. So
improvisation.
Yeah.
And you, Anna?
So first of all, I want to know who else in my family is going, how we can actually distribute the right things among all of us, right? The hard thing when one thinks about space and one thinks about even Mars is that the amount of things we have here on the Earth to make tools from is stunning. Mm-hmm. And when I think about that, it's a little more scary. So I've moved around a lot, and every time I move, I go, okay, what are the 5 books that I will bring with me? What are the 5 books I cannot? They're not going to all be books. What are the 5 books I cannot live without that I need for my brain to constantly refresh itself? And I won't go through what the books are, but that's one thing. And then I end up getting another 200 books where I go, so I have to do it again, and what's beautiful about this is that I'm constantly culling and adding. So I would definitely probably pick a book from my dear friend John Haydick, who had a way of seeing the world that was a stellar. I would definitely take The Stone Raft by Saramago, and I would take a needle and thread, a very robust needle, because I don't know what I would be doing with it. A Swiss Army knife has to be. But again, then I would distribute other stuff among my family. There has to be the pets as well. You can't go without pets.
I think you have to answer the question too to close.
I would take tools.
Yeah.
A book.
Yeah.
Lots of pencils and pens, because I'm the kind that writes. Probably a camera. Yeah. To record stuff. Yeah.
Very good. And I'm sorry we can't bring all of you. But
yeah. Well, thank you very, very much. A great panel. A big round of applause, please.
It was a pleasure.
Any questions?